Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
81 years after Japan's surrender, has Japan truly learned from its past, or is history repeating itself? Welcome to World Today, the panel discussion with me, Einar, in Beijing. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. For the countries and the peoples across Asia who suffered under Japanese militarist aggression, August 15th has never been an ordinary date. It represents the triumph of justice over aggression. It also marked the end of a war that brought immense suffering and a profound devastation to Asia. But 81 years on, we have to ask, has Japan truly confronted its wartime past? For fiscal year 2027, Japan's Ministry of Defense is seeking a record-high defense budget of 8.9 trillion yen, around $59 billion, marking the 15th consecutive year of growth. At a ceremony marking the 81st anniversary of the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, Japanese Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi made ambiguous remarks about Japan's commitment to the three non-nuclear principles, further fueling concerns. At the same time, Japan's newly established National Intelligence Bureau is being viewed as a key step toward an emerging form of new militarism. And Takaichi is pushing to revise Japan's constitution, challenging Article 9, the very provision in Japan's peace constitution that commits the country to permanently renouncing war. So 81 years after the end of the war, where exactly is Japan heading? Is this simply the normalization of Japan as a normal state, or are we witnessing the revival of a new form of militarism? To delve into this, today we are joined by three distinguished guests. Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, a Canadian think tank, and a Chairman of Asia Narratives. Welcome to our show, Einar.
It is a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Li Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Always glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. Happy to be here.
And Dr. Kuangyu, researcher at Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Liu.
Thank you. This is Kuangyu. Hello, everyone.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. 81 years ago, on August 15th, Japan announced its unconditional surrender. There is a view that, unlike Germany's deep reckoning with the crimes of Nazi Germany, Japan's reflection on its wartime history has always been rather ambiguous. Take the emperor's signed and recorded surrender rescript, for example. Use the neutral phrase, end of the war, rather than the word surrender, and you can not even find the word defeat in it. And if we look at how Japanese media report on August 15th every year, how should we assess Japan's attitude toward its history of aggression over the past 81 years? Einar, would you like to start? How far has Japan really gone in reflecting on its past?
Unfortunately, you have to look at it as going backwards. At the time, there was the 80th anniversary of the Tokyo trials has come out, and this is a reflection of the reality of what happened. They started trying Class A war criminals after the Japanese had been able to literally eradicate as much evidence as possible. They had about 3 weeks in order to get rid of it. There's numerous eyewitness accounts of smoke coming out of anywhere where there was any kind of sensitive documents. So they destroyed the evidence. Despite that, a group of prosecutors tried some Class A war criminals. The difficulty was, this is the irony, the Japanese would object. He says, well, you don't have any evidence. Well, yeah, you don't have any evidence because you destroyed it. So they used this, and they kind of continued. And unfortunately, after the first trial, instead of proceeding against the rest, including these medical units, 513 unit, which was committing the same horrific acts on people that Joseph Mengele and the Nazis were doing, they were completely excused. What happens, the U.S. wanted their research, and in return for the research, they were all given, in essence, immunity. Not only them, but even those who survived like Shinzo Abe's grandfather later became prime minister. This is the irony, is that the people today, the current party in power has been in power basically since World War II. There's ample evidence to show that it was supported by the CIA. And it has been, in essence, doing Washington's bidding, but at the same time, it's been a sore point for them. Many of them have echoed this idea that our only crime was to lose the war. They do not recognize 35 million Chinese who were killed. It represents over a third of all of the casualties during World War II. And they'll say, well, we didn't kill all of them. Yes, but you took their medicines, you took their food, you left them to die, you took their fuel, you took everything, and then you raped and killed indiscriminately using terrorism to allow you to subjugate another people. So what happens then is that they're excused. They didn't have to face the consequences of the act. The emperor was allowed to make the vague language that you talked about, and then to basically go back. Now, today, unfortunately, you had people like Shinzo Abe and Takaishi, and their intent on revising history. The Nanjing massacre has become the Nanjing incident. They still teach in books taught to children in Japan that this was a situation where the brave Japanese army was interceding between warring factions of Chinese who were indiscriminately killing and raping. And it's just nonsense. All the evidence is there, the eyewitness testimony, including by Japanese troops whose conscience overcame their shame, and they were able to give the details of what happened there. So today we stand at a point where increasingly they continue to make offers at the Yagashoni Shrine. And you have to understand that this was all started planning just after the defeat. 1954, they outlined a plan to gradually take the names of the people who were dead, the actual war criminals. They were completely destroyed, burnt, and their ashes spread at sea so they could not be deified. But they deified them anyways by adding their names to the shrine. Now, it took quite a few years to do that, but it shows that there has been a consistent strategic effort to deny the culpability for what they did. And this is where we are today with Takahashi.
That's very insightful. Dr. Liu Kuangyu, how do you view Japan's reflection on this war over the past 81 years?
Yeah, we see from the past 81 years on, the most revealing fact is that Japan has never really truly apologized to Reagan. And it has actually repeatedly, from the 1955 Moyama statement to the 2015 Abe statement, but these apologies have never been settled. They are issued, then qualified, and then partially walked by successive cabinets, by several ministers visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, and by textbook screening that steadily erases coercion. We see Germany, and like you mentioned, their reflection was institutionalized. There's a criminal law against Holocaust denial, a permanent culture of remembrance in schools, and a constitution written under Allied but also domestic authorship explicitly renounces war. So Japan's reflection was largely some sort of a procedural, a few statements and compensation scheme that were later contested and was embedded in law or shared national curriculum. And also the imperial rescript of 1945 is sort of like an original template. It speaks of enduring the unendurable, of the cruel bomb, but never of surrender, of defeat, of aggression, of their crimes. So that paper frames the Japanese people as the one who suffered, and the framing did not die with that rescript. It reproduced itself in an annual August media ritual, which centers on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the air raids, and treats the war in Asia as a kind of natural disaster rather than the policy of a conquest. And also this matters because the victimhood is not neutral memory. A country that remembers itself primarily as a victim of war finds it physically and politically much harder to accept that it was also for 15 years across East and Southeast Asia, the victimizer. And the result, we call it a split memory. Japan remembers Okinawa and the town bombings with extraordinary precision, but Nanjing massacre, like Professor just mentioned, and forced labor and also comfort women, they are forgotten. They systemically remain contested until that split is closed through education, not diplomacy, not propaganda. Japan's historical reflection will remain ambiguous. In fact, what I see Japan reflect from post-war, the post-war order or international institution, and also the peace constitution, all those mechanisms Japan feels that, well, this is first, I was betrayed, so this is forced on me. And second, this is the debt I've already paid. So this generation, they don't think I have this responsibility to hold accountable for the war 81 years ago. And also, they think this is a restraint of we being normal and being great, being the first tier country again. So that is, I think, the problem, because there is a generation shift of the status quo of that historical reflection. There is a momentum inside the Japan society.
Speaking of whether the young generation should take the responsibility for what happened in history, Dr. Lee, what's your take on Japan's reflection on this war? And we know the rescript cited the atomic bombing as one of the major reasons for ending the war, stressing the suffering caused by the bomb used by the enemy, while saying very little about the disasters Japan inflicted on Asia. How do you see this kind of narrative, which encouraged Japanese people to see themselves as victims of a war rather than the aggressors?
I think it was intentionally framed this way because before they actually surrendered, they were very divided. The military leaders were very divided on whether they should end the war. Like what you say in the rescript, they use very neutral term like ending the war without the term like surrender and things like that. Because for many Japanese military leaders, surrender was considered very dishonorable. So they did not want to accept that. And therefore, they deliberately avoided the word surrender because of its emotional and political sensitivity. And like what you have mentioned earlier, I think what I would like to say is that they were actually quite divided also on terms of their wartime responsibility, as some of the panelists mentioned. I think in 1995, one of the former Prime Minister, Murayama, actually acknowledged that Japan's colonial rule and aggression had actually caused tremendous suffering in Asia. It's a very important example that a Japanese leader who did confront Japan's wartime responsibility. But despite that, like what the other panelists had actually pointed out, they have been inconsistently reinforced. The late leader, Shinzo Abe, he was always trying to water down the statement. And in fact, he was very critical of the 1995 Murayama statement. He frequently signaled that he found certain parts of the interpretation problematic. For example, he expressed skepticism about the definition of aggression or end colonial rule. So of the current Prime Minister, Takaichi, she's like more nationalist and she adopted a very revisionist approach. Although she didn't walk back from the Murayama statement, but she also questioned the characterization of Japan's wartime actions as straightforward aggressions, meaning to say she is critical of the interpretation of Japan's wartime responsibility. Therefore, she represents one of the more nationalist positions in that debate. In fact, Japan's public memory of World War II basically centers on how the Japanese people suffered because of the atomic bombings, right? And there's less mention about its aggressions and wartime actions in Southeast Asia, in other parts of the world, like in China. So this has been, of course, the case for some time. In fact, in recent years, there have been attempts to actually whitewash or downplay the actions of the Empire Japan by making changes, for example, to the Japanese history textbooks used in the secondary schools. And these all the changes have actually raised concerns about Japan's wartime aggression, that responsibility are being presented in a less critical manner.
Einar, in Japan's post-war narrative, the identity of victim has often overshadowed, if not replaced, that of aggressor. So how do you assess this imbalance?
Well, I mean, when you're the aggressor and you've done what you've done, obviously, and you're defeated, you have to rationalize it. And for many people in Japan, it's a very proud race. They thought they were going to dominate Asia and that they would colonialize Asia before the Westerners could. Ironically, they got together with other fascist powers who were intent on world domination. So let's think of it from a different perspective. The Japanese did incredible things, and not just in China, in Korea, throughout Southeast Asia. And they don't want to admit it, but there's also a secret fear that comes behind it psychologically. When you do these things, there's a cost. The people that you train to do this, I mean, if you go to Japan today and you walked around, you wouldn't look at people and say these people are capable of throwing babies in the air and chopping them when they come down with a bayonet or catching them like they're barbecuing, roping men together, using them as bayonet practice, going to people's homes, raping old women, young women, whatever, it didn't matter, taking everything. It was just the brutality. Well, people who are the real monsters are not only ones who commit the act, but the ones who train them. The Japanese military establishment, the first year, every single day, you were beaten, you were humiliated in every psychological and physical way possible. So by the end of the first year, all you could do is wait to get revenge on the next class of cadres. So this was a institutionalized brutality. You broke people down so that they were no longer human. They were just animals. And this is a real crime. But what happens when these animals are trying to return to normal life? Not all Japanese soldiers were killed. They went back home. There's a scar that is created by these people. The things that they did, that you can't go back to being normal once you've beheaded babies and laughed about it. They went back, and there are scars with internally, but there's also this fear that what I have done to others, they will do to me. And a lot of this is why you have this kind of defensive victimization, saying, oh, poor us. We don't want to recognize what we did. We just want to cast ourselves as victims because we're afraid. And then on the other side, there is a strong case. Those who've been victimized, and this does not cover China, but there are people within China. I have friends who tell me that, they lost uncles, things. They lived in villages, and every week the Japanese commandant would call village together and select 1, 2, or 3 people at random, and they would be beheaded on the spot. He did it in order to maintain order, to terrorize the people. So when you live through something like that, and I mean as the victims, sometimes you can feel that the only answer is, in fact, violence, revenge, that power, military power is the only thing. China has been unique in that it has not given into that. It has certainly asked for reconciliation, for acknowledgement, for, a full apology and recognition of what was done. But it has not been threatening Japan. So these latest incidences where Japan is identifying China as the enemy. What enemy? They were the perpetrators of the crimes. China did not drop an atomic bomb on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. Yet, through, you saw the statements being made. They didn't mention the U.S. All they do is mention China. So, as I say, this goes to this kind of guilty mind that they have, portraying themselves as victims, saying that there's a bigger bully out there. Who's the bigger bully? Well, the people that we abused.
Very thought-provoking. Speaking of Japan's current understanding of its dual identity as both victims of war and aggressors, Dr. Liu, earlier you mentioned that many Japanese people are unwilling to shoulder the responsibility for their country's wartime history. Some Japanese scholars have pointed out pacifism in Japanese society is actually a very passive form. It's not based on the reflection that we made mistakes in the past, so now we must build peace, but rather on the attitude that we do not want to be dragged into another war, but we're not concerned about what we did in the past. How do you look at this analysis of this avoidance-based pacifism?
Yes, I think that analysis is precise and useful. Also use German as an example, as a comparison. German pacifism after 1945 was sort of like redemptive. It grew out from the conviction that Germany had committed unique evil and must therefore constrain its own sovereignty. And Japan, on the other hand, was sort of like you said, avoidant, passive. It grew out of exhaustion, out of the trauma of defeat and the protective umbrella of the U.S. alliance, not out of a settled reckoning with that what the Imperial Army had done in the war. And also Article 9 was in a brilliant constitutional gift, but that gift was imposed, like what I said, from outside. And it was forced. It was imposed from outside, not from Japanese moral consensus grow from within. We can see there's a direct rightward shift of logical connection to today. If Japan's pacifism is built on, like, we must never suffer war again, rather than we must never inflict war again. And then the moment you feel threatened by anything like from the so-called Northern Korean missiles, by the Chinese naval activity, or some issues or questions in the Taiwan Strait, or by a shifting U.S. commitment, the entire edifice can be re-described as naive. The argument becomes peacefully led us defenseless. The Japanese would say we must now re-earn our ability to arm and to avoid being so-called victimized again. And notice that this victim frame is doing all the work. The frame is actually inherited from 1945 from the imperialist script we talked about earlier. And this is why the same political forces that push for constitutional revision and also for counter-strike capability and nuclear ambiguity and so on, also the forces defend Yasukuni visits and textbook revision and this same policy portfolio. And there's one coherent project replacing the apology diplomacy since the 90s and with a narrative of national restoration. This is what Takaichi is doing right now. And the lack of historical awareness is not a coincidence of the rightward shift. It's more like a precondition. So if the country never fully internalized its wartime record, they will not be having this debate in this tone.
Dr. Lee, building on Dr. Liu's earlier point, we know Japan has long been trying to whitewash its wartime past. This April, for example, Japan's Ministry of Education approved junior high school history textbooks that glorify its history of aggression. At the same time, some Japanese scholars have raised serious concerns that young people taught this rewritten history could even come to believe that the war was about liberating Asia, which was exactly the kind of narrative Japanese militarism promoted during the war. How serious do you believe this is?
Yes, exactly. I think what you have pointed out is right. The way they understand history will be very distorted with the changes in the textbook, because the fact that they're trying to use the textbook to downplay coercion, especially in the comfort women system, and also as the forced labor, is actually pretty alarming, because these such changes that are being implemented actually contribute to what we call a revisionist account of Japan's wartime history, because they're presenting these issues in a different way from what is actually true. So they're trying to reduce Japan's responsibility. And for the younger generations, they probably do not really know what actually happened in the past because they're being educated through the textbook, right? So I think that's the difference with what we say in Germany. For example, Germany, they make it a crime if you publicly approve or deny or seriously minimize crimes that are committed under Nazi rule. So including genocide, if the statement that you make is capable of disturbing public peace. So meaning to say that the government can actually legally punish people who publicly deny that the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes took place, which is very different from Japan. And even like in German school, their textbooks also do depict Nazi Germany's aggression and responsibility for World War II quite explicitly. But in fact, in Japan, it's the other way around, that the government is trying to take a revisionist approach and trying to rewrite the history. And this is problematic because there is a possibility over time, increasing number of people may come to deny or even question whether Japanese aggression actually occurred. So as we know, the number of wartime survivors continues to decline because, as time passes, there is a greater concern that the younger generation may have less direct exposure to personal accounts. And when, they were educated through the textbooks, then they will have a different idea. Probably comes back to the narrative that indeed, what Japanese did in the past was to liberate Asia. This is the kind of narrative they're trying to construct these days. So in fact, there was a survey that was being rolled out. There is already uncertainty about how the war is being understood. Because when they did the survey, only 42% of these respondents evaluate what Japanese did in World War II as an aggressive war. Meaning to say that more than 50% of the people are either unsure or say that what Japanese did was not deemed as aggressive. Yeah, so this actually raises a lot of questions about how history will be remembered by the future generations.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for your in-depth perspectives. Let's have a short break. Coming back, we'll continue our discussion on Japan's post-war historical reckoning and its path toward remilitarization. This is World Today. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're listening to World Today, the panel discussion with me, Einar. We've been talking about Japan's failure to truly confront its wartime past and what that means for its military trajectory today. Let's continue our discussion. Let's delve into Japan's recent moves today. Einar, Article 9 of Japan's constitution says Japan forever renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes, and it will not maintain land, sea, and air forces as well as other war potential. That's why it's known as the Peace Constitution, and it has been a cornerstone of Japan's post-war peaceful development. But from the Abe government to the Takaichi government, we've seen a series of policies steadily breaking through this framework, acquiring counter-strike capabilities, lifting the ban on arms exports, revising the three security documents, and repeatedly increasing defense spending to record levels. Does all of this mean that the Peace Constitution is now somehow essentially dead in everything but name? Is this a real and a serious concern?
It's a very real concern. Before we talk about Japan and the other people, the Japanese people are no one's enemy. The Japanese people, they're trying to get by. They have very difficult economic circumstances, and they have leaders that are ignoring their needs. The issue here is that you had a party, a group of very conservative Japanese who perpetuated the war. And then instead of being exposed for the criminals they were, they eventually found themselves taking power. So, of course, they sought to justify what they did. They came up with this rationale. Our only crime was to lose. And they've been perpetuating it. And it's been part of a long-term plan. You go back to 54 and, they were already plotting how they were going to deify themselves and their fellow criminals as war heroes. And that's we still live with that today. So what do you have Takaichi doing? She's a continuation of Abe, these very, very conservatives. I don't believe that she actually has all of this, the same thing as Abe. She didn't have a grandfather in the war. She came from a very middle background, but she's a populist. And she sees this as a way to gain power. And this is the danger today, especially not just in Japan, but throughout most of the democratically elected places. Democracy is not bad. It's not democracy that fails people. It's people who fail democracy. And in this particular case, people, as I said, are desperate. So they're willing to listen to some voice to say it's very, very simple. So Article 9, the last group that can prevent it are the Japanese people, because there would have to be a referendum and an overwhelming number, I think 3/4 would have to agree that it was okay to change the Constitution and therefore nullify this Article 9. But the fact is the current government is trying to undermine it piece by piece by coming up with these supposed threats, like somehow Taiwan is a defensive issue for Japan. These are just subtexts, but beneath them, it's very interesting. You have to kind of look, what does this mean to the United States? And in theory, the United States is cheering on this idea that Japan is doubling its defense budget, going to 2% at a time when obviously the people are hurting. But does Japan really like the fact not only that it has this peacetime constitution enforced on them, but also that they've been an occupied country since 1945? There's 50,000 troops spread out over Japan, and many of them concentrated in Okinawa. There have been constant references to the crimes committed by young servicemen who are out, rapes, killings, etc. This is something that's almost unbearable to all my Japanese. And there are two approaches. If you go to the mayor of Okinawa, he wants them out. He does not want these servicemen here or anywhere in Japan. He's not trying to say move it into somebody else's backyard. He's saying these people should not be here. And then you have the Japanese who are taking the long view, will tolerate this embarrassment, this humiliation, until we can get rid of them. A lot of what is happening here, in my view, is Japan is trying to develop their own nuclear umbrella. Why? The United States has shown itself to be somewhat mercurial, only interested in itself under Donald Trump. But he was elected twice. And Biden, despite giving a more friendly face, did not, in fact, change the trajectory. So the Japanese are looking at the United States and saying, are they really reliable? Would they come to our aid in the event of some imaginary attack? In most instances, they talk about North Korea. And then there's a second issue that they want to get rid of the U.S. If they use American unreliability as a basis to establish their own nuclear power, they can then ask the U.S. to leave because there's no need to have your troops stationed here or your military or anything like that. We don't trust you. We have our own nuclear power. You need to go. This would be a somewhat problem for the U.S. because they're so used to assuming that Japan is their aircraft carrier within Asia. They have a lot of these, but Japan is an important one because of the length of its land and things like that through these islands. So, what happens to the architecture of Asia if, in fact, Japan does go nuclear? Well, it's quite probable that other countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, anyone who can afford it will say, we have to have the same, especially right now when people are looking at Iran. And they're saying if Iran had a nuclear deterrent, that would have prevented them from having their leadership decapitated and being bombed. Well, the attempt is to bomb them into submission, but it isn't working. So the world is changing. Takaichi and her group are trying to take advantage of it, not for the benefit of the Japanese people. No one is threatening to invade Japan. Right? That is the simple fact. So this idea that there are unnamed actors out there, quite truthfully, even North Korea, although extremely belligerent, is not saying they're going to invade Japan. They couldn't do it. They've given up the idea of even uniting South Korea. What he wants, or seems to want, is recognition of North Korea as an independent, sovereign, normalized nation. He's going about it in a very belligerent way, but he believes that this is the only card that they have, this nuclear one. So this idea that somehow Japan is going to be blown out of the water by North Korea is just something that these very conservative people who want to deny their culpability for their grandfather's actions during World War before and during World War II, this is a fantasy that they're trying to sell to the Japanese people. But unfortunately, they're succeeding. They're brainwashing young children into believing that Japan was just trying to help. If anything happened, oh, well, you have to break the eggs to make an omelet. They're normalizing the atrocities that they did. And this is dangerous because, as my colleagues pointed out, all of a sudden it'll be normalized. And once again, Japan is the victim of arbitrary forces who are trying to keep it down, when in fact it's quite the opposite.
There's so much here for us to unpack. Let's start by talking about Japan's nuclear ambition. Dr. Lee, on one hand, Japan is accelerating its remilitarization. On the other hand, it has also adopted an ambiguous posture on the nuclear issue, trying to get more room on building its nuclear capacity. Some scholars say Japan is maintaining an anti-nuclear image abroad while keeping all the conditions it could need to develop nuclear weapons in a short period of time. What's your take on this? Is this nuclear ambiguity actually the most dangerous part of Japan's remilitarization today?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because for me, personally, do not think it's possible for Japan to, at present, to develop nuclear weapons within such a short period of time. They do not have the capacity to do so because, developing nuclear weapons will require significant resources. You need time and technical capabilities. And in fact, look at Iran. They have been trying to develop nuclear weapons for many, many years, and still it has been unsuccessful. But even though they're not able to develop nuclear weapons, for Japan, but it's possible that they could actually acquire it through the nuclear umbrella by the US, meaning to say that they can request the US to actually transfer nuclear weapons to Japan. But again, I think this is very alarming because like what the other panelist Einar has mentioned, the other countries, for example, South Korea, would also be asking the US to transfer nuclear weapons to them if Japan successfully able to do so. So, but again, even though we see there is a possibility that Japan going in that direction, moving in that direction to require the US to transfer nuclear weapons to them, but I believe that would be strong public backlash. We have to differentiate between what the ordinary people think and what the Japanese government thinks. I think the ordinary people, they actually love peace. That's the reason why the government did not actually push for revision of the constitution, especially on the Article 9. In fact, they do with the reinterpretation of Article 9 to expand their military capabilities. The reason is because they knew that the public would disagree and it will be politically difficult to actually get approval for the revision to Article 9. So I think it's important to create a distinction here between what ordinary people want and think and what the Japanese government actually want and think and do. Specifically, I think there are a lot of issues that the Japanese public is facing, like the aging society, the rising debt. The public, they will not be willing to see their money actually spent on further military expansion, specifically on developing nuclear weapons. Like we have discussed earlier on, even though the victims of the atomic bombings is declining over the years, but then the memories have not at all faded. Some of the new generations, they still understood what would be the consequences if they were again being hit by nuclear weapon. Because of that, I do not believe they would support their government in producing or researching on developing nuclear weapon. And in fact, we can see that the people, they continue to be reminded of the enormous human suffering actually caused by nuclear weapons. And there is this international norms that are pushing against, developing or acquiring nuclear weapons. And these are the norms that actually would pressure the Japanese government from not adopting this stance. And in fact, in Southeast Asia, we have maintained a very strict anti-nuclear stance because what we want is, we've seen if countries, started racing, wanting to acquire nuclear weapon, in the end, it will be destructive. Because one of the things about nuclear weapon is you have this assured mutually destruction. Meaning to say, if you have a nuclear weapon, I have nuclear weapon, there's a possibility that we could have used it against each other and we will be mutually destructive. Therefore, in Southeast Asia, specifically ASEAN, this regional bloc, we actually enforces the Southeast Asian Nuclear Weapon Free Zone Treaty, and we actually uphold it until today.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lee, one follow-up question, because many believe Japan's anti-war and pro-constitution forces already been pushed to the margins as a minority by the right-wing politicians. So when those radical politicians frame military expansion as being about national security, will or can ordinary Japanese people really stand up and stop it?
I think what you have pointed out is very important because if they're going to rewrite the history through textbooks, if they're going to reframe the whole narrative, of course, ordinary people, they would not know what truly happens. But what is important is that there are also other sources of history that can be actually promoted to the Japanese people. Like, for example, in Southeast Asia, it's indeed that we have suffered in the hands of Imperial Japan during World War II. And then there are, sources of history pointed out that this is in fact the truth. So I think the Japanese people should be looking at more sources to understand history rather than relying on just mainly the domestic sources. And what's more important is, as it's taking place right now, revisionist approach to history, I think they should have counter narrative, meaning that push back against this revisionist approach. It's because there are still survivors that are still living right now. Their personal accounts should be preserved, should be promoted so that the public, the Japanese public, truly understands, what Imperial Japan did during World War II. I think, and one of the things which is reassuring for me is that at least Japan, there are still a democratic country. So if the public knew that the government is trying to rewrite history and going towards, glorifying war, they can actually have a choice to actually vote down this government. and they could have chosen a more peace-loving government who would adhere to the pacifist doctrine that they actually adopted after World War II.
So, Dr. Liu Kuangyu, how do you assess Japan's ambiguity over the nuclear issue these days, and what does Takaichi government's calculation behind this?
I think the nuclear ambiguity is certainly the most consequential element because everything else, like we might talk today, like on the so-called counter-strike missiles, also the Aegis destroyers, F-35s, and so on, they operate within a non-nuclear framework, and the region has learned how to manage. A nuclear-armed Japan would rewrite the entire security architecture of East Asia and also trigger responses from the neighboring countries and possibly could cause a cascade into a regional nuclear arms race. That is the worst scenario. And also, Takaichi's Fukushima performance was revealing. He pledged to uphold the three non-nuclear principles, but described them as the so-called policy stance rather than a national policy, rather than a policy that she must hold. So she refused to prejudge whether the no introduction clause would survive the year-end revision of the three security documents. And this is not something like neutral wording. I think that Japan is downgrading from what is called national policy to a policy stance. It's a preparation move. It makes the future revision look more like technical adjustment rather than a historical rupture. So this is the salami slicing strategy. And also, Koizumi is probably called in July for a unrestricted nuclear debate to be read in the same context. I think that these trial balloons, they are coordinated. And also we see the scholarly argument that Japan retains all the conditions necessary to develop nuclear weapons within a short period. I think this is technically very accurate. Japan has world's third largest stockpile of separated plutonium, and the fuel cycle capability is complete, is full. They have very advanced rocketry through the H3 and Epsilon programs, and also industrial base to weaponize in months if political decisions were made. So this is the standard terminology. This is a paranuclear state. So once screwdrivers turn from the threshold, there's only one very little step. I think this is almost the most dangerous element. What is the most consequential? The most immediate dangers, I think, is all these things are manageable. Together, they will create Japan that could maybe in the future, in a crisis, whether a foreign policy crisis or domestic political crisis, they will cross the threshold that was unthinkable in a decade ago and do so under domestic political pressure rather than very cool strategic calculation. There is not very coherent logic behind this.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Liu Kuangyu, we were just talking about the anti-war and pro-constitution forces inside Japan. There is another very concrete contradiction we should look at, and this also mentioned by Einar earlier. The Takaichi government is accelerating military expansion, is also cutting spending on people's livelihoods. Some Japanese protesters put it very bluntly, Japan is a country with a low food self-sufficiency rate. What exactly are we going to use to fight a war? What's your take on this? What deeper anxiety does this kind of criticism from ordinary people reflect?
We see that the Japanese defense budget growing very fast. There were 15 consecutive years of growth. For example, if you put into a context, recently in the financial year 2021, that budget was around 5.3 trillion yen, and in 6 years, it has already nearly doubled. And Japan is now on the track to become the world's third largest military spender, and behind only even the U.S. and China. But also we know that the economy in Japan is quite weak for now, and we know that Japanese government and also the U.S. government has been quite busy and quite worried about Japan's steps, about their market, about their industry, and also the social equity. And so that is one thing that happens very similar in Taiwan. You see the ruling political government, the ruling office, they are putting all their resources on the military spend, and they just cut short what should be spent on education and social welfare, and also to support industry transformation, upgrade, and also to support the lower income families, young parents to support it, to raise their children. So when a country or a region like Taiwan they think themselves as some sort of, we are a front base of the U.S., of the island chain, and we need to extract all our resources, almost all of our resources for a wartime preparation. We need to put everything and transfer everything, every penny into a weapon from the U.S. or put every man or woman up front in the war front. So those rulers, they won't care about economy. They will care about social warfare. I think when I say, okay, we need to fight against Chinese mainland, we need to ally with the U.S., we need to fight for so-called democracy and our freedom, we will win the vote, we will win elections. So why do I worry about economy? The question is about economy. But Japan, I think that's why we see Takaichi, her supporting rate is falling pretty drastically now to around 50% level, which is her minimal level since her took office. So I think there is some blind spot. She's neglecting that. She's trying to push law for the cession of the throne so that her faction can produce maybe in the future another Japanese emperor. And also she's neglecting the public basic need of the especially most fundamental civil requirement. I don't think this is a logic of politics should last. This is the logic, what I call a militarist government, will trying to insist that so-called security and so-called war preparation is the first place and everything to move away for this.
Mm-hmm. Einar, earlier you also talked about the economic reality Japan is facing right now. The yen keeps weakening, Japan's population has been declining for 15 straight years, and the local communities are becoming increasingly hollowed out. Some Japanese scholars have warned very clearly that if Japan keeps increasing defense spending at the expense of everything else, its economy and people's livelihoods could collapse. But also, as Dr. Liu pointed out, economic pressures could actually be used by right-wing politicians as a pretext to accelerate Japan's militarization. How do you see this analysis and this warning?
Okay, it is not a supposition. Takaichi has already said that militarization is good for the economy. The more we spend on it, the more jobs are created and the more benefits to Japan, which is, of course, nonsense. Every time a government spends money, it's an investment. And if you spend money on a weapon, the only investment you have is death and destruction. If you use it, you've lost. If you don't lose it, you've lost economically. If you build a bridge, it's an investment. People use the bridge. It's used for commerce, for people to get back and forth. That has a return on it. So what she's proposing is completely distorting the reality. And unfortunately, it's the same pattern that was used in the very beginning when Japan was expanding. They said, we're going to reindustrialize so that we're not dominated. And then we're going to take our industrialization and we're going to conquer all of Asia because it's good for them. And that's what led to this kind of fascistic organization that spread death and destruction wherever it went. At this point, that ship has sailed. Whether the Japanese people believe it or not, that is a political question. I would agree with my colleague, Dr. Liu, that the last bastion of defense against these people are the Japanese people themselves. But what I fear is a false flag attack. This isn't, tin hat conspiracy theory. The Japanese used the Manchurian incident as a false flag operation to start the war against China. Since World War II, there have been innumerable cases of false flag operations, not so much by Japan because they weren't actively involved, but with the United States, by Israel, by other countries. So this idea that it can't happen, please consider. If the Japanese elite are dedicated to this idea that the only way that they can be proud again is to have military power, they will do whatever is necessary. These are people who say, yes, we can crack eggs to make an omelet. Now, in terms of the nuclear thing, I'm going to have to disagree with Professor Lee, agree with Professor Liu. The fact is, Japan has 44 tons of nuclear material. Just under 9 tons of that is based in Japan. The rest is being held outside of Japan. You only need, there's less than 1 kilogram of plutonium in the bomb at Hiroshima. If you have 8 times that amount, you have a significant weapon, and that would be 8 kilos. So when you start talking about tons, they have it. Now, I've talked to a number of people at different times, came down to, well, what do you think the nuclear capabilities of Japan are? And a couple of times people said the same thing. They said, well, we believe there are subterranean basements where all the components are there, and they would simply have to be assembled. And it would take between minutes to a few hours to get them things. Now, obviously, Japan has a sophisticated ballistic missile program, so delivery is not a problem. They have all the technology to reduce it. They have all the fissile materials. So this idea that they can't produce a nuclear weapon, I think that is completely wrong, and it contradicts everything that I've known and talked about for the last 30 years, because this isn't new. And remember, Israel has over 200 nuclear weapons. It's the worst kept secret in the world. They do not belong to the IAEA. They might have stolen American technology, but the point being that countries can do it. Israel is a country of less than 7.5 million, of which only 5 million are actually Jewish. So this idea that a country can't develop is, I think, nonsensical. And quite frankly, the Japanese, in terms of technology, have been ahead of Israel for many, many years. So I think we have to prepare ourselves for this idea that they might frame some small false flag attacks in order to make it plausible for them to go to the people and say, look, you have to pass this referendum. The U.S. is unreliable, and, there's bad things happening out there, and China is the one we suspect. And if they get that referendum through, then there's no stopping them. So I think the situation is quite serious. The capabilities are obviously there, and I think these people are intent on, quote, restoring their pride at any cost.
Mm-hmm. That's very alarming indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, let's move to the final question, because 81 years on, one fact is clear: the perpetrator or the aggressor has yet to fully or truly reflect on his past. And we've seen a disturbing trend, which seemed to point to a very clear trajectory from pacifism toward remilitarization. So let me end today's conversation with this one question for all three of you. When the aggressor is forgotten and history textbooks start glorifying aggression, how can a country that refuses to face its own past make sure it doesn't repeat the same mistakes? Einar, why don't you start us off?
I don't think between the brainwashing and perhaps a false flag attack and this constant linking the military, national security with technological and economic competition is slowly pushing a lot of the Japanese people towards these things, especially the younger ones. They're not as aware. Obviously, they don't have, it might have been their grandparents, but it's not as real in time to them, and their concerns are about economics. So if somebody promises them, everything will be just fine, and this is just part of the formula, they might go for it. So I really do fear populist politicians who use these types of strategies in order to get what they want. And remember, Takeshi, I call her a populist, but she's using this kind of very, very conservative thinking, going back to these war criminals, as a basis for her power. And that's what populists do. They may not believe in what they're doing. They believe that they should have power, but they'll use anything at hand in order to maintain their power. She might think that she's doing Japan a great favor. In actuality, she's not paying attention, as we've all agreed, to what the Japanese people need, which is a plan that says how can it become relevant, and it needs to become relevant by being able to compete. If you don't want to bring immigration in, you have to start thinking about robotics. You have to start changing things. You need to get away from this idea that 60% of your food comes from outside of Japan, that 98% of your energy comes from outside Japan. They have the technology to go windmills and also solar panels and things like that. The question is, why haven't they? Given the ups and downs of the oil market, not just now, but we can go back to 73. So there are real questions about the stewardship of Japan in terms of it, and massive debt to over 250% of the GDP. It's really put them in a very vulnerable position, even to the extent where the U.S. had to take the unprecedented move of defending the Japanese yen because they're afraid the Japanese were going to start selling their U.S. treasuries, which would drive up the interests that they would have to be paid on those treasuries. And this is what they were afraid of. Besant is not somebody who cares about anybody else. He was the one who engineered, along with Soros, the Asian financial crisis. So don't tell me that he's a caring individual. He's doing this out of protection of American interests, which right now center around how much debt the U.S. can sell to the world, especially in view of central banks walking away from it continually.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Lee, what's your final remark? Can a country that forgets its aggression avoid repeating it?
I think, to be honest, we don't know. History may or may not repeat itself, right? But I think what we can do now is very important, that we continue to challenge revisionist accounts. And then we have to ensure that accurate historical accounts are being passed down through generations. Like earlier, other panelists said that the Japanese government is trying to inflate the trade narrative to justify their military expansion. And then I think we should actually build counter-narrative against this one. What is important is, I think the people should be reminded of the atrocities and consequences of the war. Even like I said earlier, I think younger generation, they did not experience these wars themselves. But there are still testimonies, there are still historical records and educational materials that can serve as reminder and help prevent them from repeating the mistakes of previous generations. I understood that, the government is trying to rewrite the whole history. But again, as I've mentioned earlier, there are different sources of that should actually be promoted and also being passed to the next generation. Because if we're simply just allowing Japan government to just rewrite the history, to deny the history, then what are the sufferings of those victims? Are you going to deny their sufferings? Are you going to tell them that actually, that did not happen? This should be historical denial should actually be made illegal.
That's a very important point. Dr. Liu, what's your final remark?
To be honest, only time knows. But what I know is that every country that refuses to examine its history increases the possibility of repeating these so-called structural mistakes. Also, that mistakes in the Imperial Japan, it was pretty specific. We see a captured foreign policy, a military unconstrained by civilian authority, and also an ideology, national victimhood that justified expansion. So today, although none of these conditions are fully present, but the crucial insight from comparative studies of democratic backsliding is that really happens through a single dramatic rupture. It happens through the accumulation of small changes, and each of which is defensible on its own terms, and until the cumulative result of a country that the previous generation would not recognize. So it's more like what we call the shape of Theseus. So I think Japan is in that process now. But I think three things need to be done according to our conversation today. First, the historical record should be defended in education, not because Japan is uniquely guilty, but because I think any democracy requires informed citizenry. And second, Article 9 of the Constitution should be properly enforced rather than hollowed out. And third, the peace movement inside Japan's society. I always think the majority of Japanese people, they're peace-loving, normal people, they should be the key of controlling that desire to remilitarize their country. So the domestic peace movement we should encourage, and they should find their way in their domestic politics. My final point, the question is that whether Japan would drift into a new form of militarization, I don't think it would be a simple or a direct repeat of 1930s. That would be a question. And the most dangerous thing about Japan's relationship to the past is not it remembers too much or too little, but it remembers selectively. So a country that only remembers its own suffering would always be vulnerable to the argument that it must rearm to avoid suffering again. And this is a cycle, and this is a cycle that's very hard to be broken.
That's a very insightful point. 81 years later, the war may be over, but the reckoning is not. Thanks to all of our panelists for those valuable insights. Einar Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, a Canadian think tank, and Chairman of Asia Narratives. Dr. Lee Pei-mei, Assistant Professor of Political Science at the International Islamic University, Malaysia. Dr. Liu Kuangyu, Researcher at the Institute of Taiwan Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. That's all the time for this edition of World Today. I'm Anna. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.